So I'm Chris Gear, I'm the MyStar Professional Learning Coordinator, and I know you all and you know me, so thanks for being here. Lindsay is with me today, my learning series cohort, or my learning series partner in crime. And Barb McIntyre is with us today also. She's on our assessment team, and she's, like me, a retired MyStar teacher. She's been working with MyStar assessments for quite a few years. And Barb and I were in New Orleans at the NSTA conference just a few days ago. And so we're going to share with you, we did 3 presentations and we kind of picked some highlights from each of them and hopefully some useful things that you can take away here at the end of the day. So please make sure that you can sign in here on slide 2. And we're going to go ahead and welcome you. And all right, thank you very much. All right, so our outline here, Barb and I did presentations on differentiation and opportunities to differentiate. And because we were doing NSTA, we weren't doing things very MyStar specific, because MyStar is pretty much just in Michigan, but we kind of used, here's what we do in MyStar and here's, how it might work in your classroom. So we talked a little bit about differentiation and how you could do it in a 5E lesson, which MyStar uses that 5E format. We just renamed the E's. And then Barb did a session on standards-based grading, and she showed off the new grading guidance that's in the pre-post test in MyStar, and talked about how the 3D assessments in MyStar are structured in a certain way so that you can kind of tell kids are moving from level 1 to level 2 to level 3 and so on based on how they do in those assessments. And then we highlighted our CER off-the-shelf lesson and a couple of key pieces that we kind of figured out that we think are really helpful for teachers to help their kids be more successful at CERs. And so we're going to do just little highlights about each of those, hopefully give you something that you can use maybe tomorrow or, later next week. And then hopefully if we have a little time left over, we'll do a little discussion time and you can ask us questions. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started on differentiation. And so we were looking at opportunities for differentiation in a NGSS aligned unit. And so we just changed it to MyStar units for today because we're all MyStar teachers. So I'm going to invite you to jump in on slide 6. And these little circles are like little dots. We did dots on paper in the actual presentation last week. But out of these things that are listed here, which of these would count as differentiation? So we're going to ask you to just jump in that slide, grab a dot, and drag it over if you think what's being described there is differentiation. We'll give you just a couple minutes to do that. Okay, I'm just checking the access. Good, make sure everybody has access. So I spent most of my career in Grosse Pointe, and when I started in Grosse Pointe in the late 90s, they had differentiation was one of their big initiatives. And so they spent a fair amount of money sending us to work with some experts at University of Virginia, some ASCD authors and things like that on differentiation. So I have a pretty decent background in differentiation, and I used it in my classroom for a long time. And then when I started teaching MyStar, I was like, MyStar's pretty good at meeting kids at a lot of different levels. But as we've worked through MyStar and kind of refined it and revised those units and stuff, we've started to kind of really look for places where we can very specifically differentiate. So I would agree that all of these are options for differentiating, with the exception of, and it looks like you guys agree too, with the exception of maybe that last one. Differentiation does not mean individualized instruction, and it's not going to happen every day. And knowing that, I think, is a big relief. Otherwise, thinking about how am I going to run my classroom at 3 different levels all day, every day is overwhelming. And that's not what differentiation is. Or it's not what it should be. If people are expecting you to do that, that's, completely unreasonable. So when I took those classes at University of Virginia, one of the things they showed us was kind of a visual with this wavy line. And actually, if I were better with the graphics, I would have made the flat part where we're together longer. And then this part where we split apart a little bit shorter, and then more time together. So the most of the time, your kids are going to be doing the same thing, but you're going to look for opportunities when it might work to give kids things at different levels and allow them to either be a little more supported or a little more challenged. So it should be proactive. It's not something that happens in reaction to what kids do or say in the classroom, as much as you have an idea ahead of time that I'm going to provide this for kids. Should be high quality. It does not have to be high quantity. Rooted in assessment means, you're going to use formative assessment to help you think about what your kids might need. Should be student-centered, and often or most often will involve a lot of student choice. And it should be a blend of whole class, group, and individual instruction with, the differentiation is not going to be the bulk of your week or your month, but you're going to look for points when it can happen. And so in the MyStar lessons, which are 5E lessons, we think differentiation happens pretty naturally and pretty comfortably at the end of the share. And also it can happen within the assessments at the end of each lesson or unit. And so you're probably aware that we have differentiated reading guides, and that is going to happen following the consensus discussion in the share. We have listed them as optional, and you can use them lots of different ways, for homework or sub plans or whatever. But this is a good opportunity to let those kids stretch a little bit. The kids who are getting it really quickly, you can give them the above grade level reading, and it's going to take them maybe a little bit beyond middle school level, maybe into some high school level concepts. The reading is going to be a little more complex. We're going to ask them to do a little more high level thinking without much scaffolding, which they appreciate. And then we have that low grade level that's going to help the kids who do struggle with language to kind of get started. And we do also really want to make sure that we're letting everybody have the opportunity to work at least at grade level.
Well, I have a quick question. Is A the high level or is C the highest level?
C is the high level.
C is?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. A is at grade level. And we purposely didn't do it sequentially because we didn't want kids to feel like the A was the high, the B was the middle, the C was the low. And if you're in the C level, it's like you're getting a C grade or whatever that you were less than. So one of the things, in fact, we'll talk briefly at the end of this little chunk. One of the things I learned at University of Virginia is, it's often more comfortable if the level, you don't emphasize it in terms of levels. We're going to think about choices instead. And so we very purposely kind of made them A, B, and C, but they're not listed sequentially in terms of level.
And then does that stay the same through all of the units? Those
yes.
same?
Yep.
Okay.
A is always grade level. So you could think of A as at, B is below, and C is then the above grade level.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. In my classroom, we use colors. Colors is even less. There's, absolutely nothing sequential or hierarchical about colors, but colors was hard to translate into black and white Google Docs. So we chose A, B, and C. But I used red, green, and purple, and that was great because there was no connotation high or low about colors. Differentiation can be rooted in formative assessment. So at the end of the share or explain, we had an explain phase there for the non-MyStar people. So we have the differentiated readings, but then in the unit or in the lessons that have the embedded assessments, the bigger kind of mid-unit little quizzes, instead of having the differentiated readings, we have the analysis questions, which is a practice assessment that looks very much like the embedded assessment. And you can use that as formative assessment. And then based on how kids do on those analysis questions, we offer reteach activities, we offer extensions, and then the opportunity to, take the quiz again when you do that embedded assessment. And so that kind of looks like this. So we're going to have we're going to be in the share explain phase, and everybody does the analysis questions. And they're kind of a practice for the embedded assessment. And then based on how kids do on that, you can either offer them reteach activities or extensions. And the reteach and extensions tend to be things that kids can do relatively independently. So you can provide them as homework, you can provide them as something kids do with a parapro. You can have kids doing the same, doing each of these in the same classroom because they're kind of working on their own or in small groups. So, and then come back together and do that final embedded assessment at the end of the unit. So again, there's that pattern where we're together, then we're going to split apart for a little bit and then come back together. And so this is Unit 85A, which is a brand new one, this assessments. And Barb and Greg just put these together fairly recently. And so they're getting pretty good at doing this. And so you can kind of see in the embedded assessment looks like this. You're looking at the teacher guide, obviously, with the red. And the context is the movement of radioactive particles because it has to do with density. It's the unit is on weather. And then the analysis questions, which would come before the embedded assessment, looks almost exactly the same, right? There's a little more support and it's a different context. It's about particles moving from burning coal. But if your kids can do really well on slide 13, then they're certainly going to be able to do the embedded assessment on slide 12 well. If they don't do so well on that analysis question practice quiz, then we have a reteach activity where they're going to do something similar again, but now they've got more support. Part of that model is already filled in on that first page. There are sentence starters and prompts and fewer questions in the multiple choice and things like that. So they're going to get a second shot at it with a little more support before they're asked to do the embedded assessment. And again, it looks very similar, but Barb and Greg have come up with another context. So this is particles.
I just literally read this weekend because we're starting this. And the question with the models is exactly the same. It's the same answer. I mean, I sent my star a message like, hey, I'm definitely going to use the assessment to look at kids and, help them per like this, we call them like formative assessments, but it's to check your progress. But as I build up to that, I noticed that the reteach and the analysis questions, half of them were the exact same. The processing one, number 8, was different, but the models and like prevailing winds, like it was the same question, same answer for all 3 of those, the reteach, the analysis, and the embedded for this exact lesson 4 and 8.5A update.
Yes, they are designed to be that way to help kids get ready. I think you'll notice though that the answers are, I believe the answers, it's been a little while since I worked on this one, but I believe the answers are scrambled a little bit. So if the right answer is A, it's not. And the context is different, but we do add a lot of the same scaffolding pieces, a lot of the same questions. And that's not like that in every unit, but in this unit, we did do it that way with a different context. And a lot of the units we will do that. We'll try to make them very, very similar and even use some of the exact same questions with a different order of the answer to help students and so that teachers can also use it if they want, depending on how you want to use these, because these are very, very flexible. So maybe you're not going to use it, maybe you're going to use the analysis questions as a study guide, Or maybe you're going to use them as a retest, or maybe you're going to use them as a whole class instructional piece and help students to understand how the sense-making process works. And so you're going to work it through it together in small groups and then come together as a class and look at, now, how did I use some of these multiple choice questions? How did I use my model? How did I use all of that to build that final answer? So we do try in like the reteach to give them pieces. So you might have noticed, like in the model, we give them a little bit of the model, we give them some sentence starters in the reteach, and it's not like that in every unit. Some units will take a look at the EA and the analysis questions. We try to make those as similar as we can, because we want students to have that chance to kind of practice. And this was all teachers asked for all of this. This was all in response to teacher requests saying, you know, my kids are struggling on these EAs. What can we do to prepare them to be ready?
Is this preparing them? Because like when we get to the test, they're not going to have the same questions worded exactly the same with the same, like it's Beaker, it's the what Beaker has the highest density. If I remember this one, it was like Beaker 3, and it was the same question per the 3 items. But when you get to the test, you're not going to have anything that it's that leading. So is it giving me correct information that they understand the standard in the question, or is it giving me false information that they understand it? So like, I get what you're saying about how to teach it for sure. But when I look at it from an analysis point, I'm like, do the students get the question?
And you know, you have the option to not use those analysis questions if you don't want to. So those are just an optional piece that you can use if you'd like to. But if you want to use it as a retest later on, maybe that's what you'd like to do. Some of the reteaches too, we take a look at what might be the most challenging in that EA. And so let's say we think that reading the circle graphs is going to be the hardest. The reteach might be like practice reading circle graphs, or maybe the modeling of sum of forces we think is going to be the most challenging for kids in a given EA. Then sometimes that reteach will be specifically that, or variables. So it really depends on the unit, but these are all of the assessment pieces are just tools for you to use however you would like. So if you feel like that's going to, you know, not give you the information you want, don't feel like you have to use any assessment piece that doesn't fit your needs and doesn't give you the information that you want.
Thanks for the explanation. I was just trying to type it in, because when I did reach out to MyStar and I was like, hey, what's going on with these stark similarities? And I didn't get a response. So I wondered if it was an error or if it was intentional. So thank you.
No, it was probably intentional. And, you know, we kind of felt like this stuff was particularly challenging for students because we don't have a whole lot of density. And this is some really involved stuff when we start thinking about all of these factors that pertain to this particle movement. So we wanted to give kids lots of opportunities, if teachers want to use them, to have some practice, or again, retest. In my district, any student that didn't get better, a C or better on an assessment, had to be retested. I probably would have held back those analysis questions, and I would have used that as my reteach or as my retest. So, but it's up to you to use them however you would like. And it also may depend on your group. Like you may have a certain group of students, say you've got a special education group that really needs this kind of support before they're ready for the EA. You may choose again to differentiate and to only use the analysis questions and the reteach for those students and use some of the extension materials for all of your other students. So it's really flexible for you.
Thanks, Melissa. I'm sorry that you didn't get a response. Usually that's something that, you know, gets forwarded to one of us. And so I'm not quite sure what happened, but I'm glad that we were able to talk about it today. And Melissa, if you're teaching this and this, this extension guide is not in the unit currently, it's on the list to be added because I just created it a couple weeks ago for this, but send me an email and I'd be happy to send you the document, or, you know, anybody here, and it'll show up in the unit shortly. But this would be an example then of an extension. If your kids do well on the analysis questions, they don't need to go through the other repetitive stuff. you can send them to this website. There's a podcast they can listen to and also text they can read. And it takes them a little bit beyond where we need them to be, to talk about ocean currents. And then there's a visible thinking routine to go with that. And so whenever you're asking kids to think about, what did you read and how does it apply, not just to themselves, but what does this mean, kind of in terms of the world in general and bigger questions, that's an opportunity for differentiating kids, kind of taking them beyond just what's happening in the classroom. So
and if you have the time, I really recommend looking at these extension resources, because you might find, some of them truly are an extension. Like this one would be really appropriate for the majority of your class. So if you just wanted to use some of those analysis questions and teach with those students that are going to struggle with, the rigor of that EA, this would be great to do with the rest of your students. It's not so extension that it wouldn't be appropriate for the majority of your students.
So I'm going to skip slide 16 because we've just had a little conversation kind of about noticing and wondering. And I'm going to finish up my little differentiation part, and then I'm going to let Barb talk about standards-based grading. But the other opportunity to do some differentiation comes with our summative assessments, especially the pre-post test at the end of the unit. And Barb has offered this at our assessment series, different PLs. And I think these are great and these are helpful for teachers too. But one way to give kids some choice on the final assessment is, assuming the final assessment has, say, 4 cluster scenarios, most of them are between 3 and 5. You can ask kids to complete all the clusters, but then have them select the ones that you want them, or that they want you to grade. And so you can say, for everybody, I'm going to grade one of them. And then I want you to select the one that you want me to grade, and have them select a backup in case they select the one that you're already deciding to grade. But anyway, that's an opportunity for some differentiation. Students have some choice about which one you're going to focus on. It also makes your grading faster. Or you can just flat out say, hey, there's 4 scenarios here, pick 2 of them to complete, and I'll grade the ones that you select. And so there are ways that speeds things up a little bit for you, for them, but also it allows them some choice. Let's, do the ones that you're interested in, that you think you're going to do the best on. And then this last slide that we shared, and this was an hour presentation at NSTA, and we're doing it in like 15 minutes here. So we're trying to do highlights. But this was important to me when I was trying to set up differentiation in my classroom. I was worried about how am I going to explain this to my kids, that sometimes people are going to be doing different things. And I didn't want anybody to feel like I thought they were stupid. So I gave them, this, and I didn't want it to be my judgment on their ability, right? Because I didn't want to limit kids. And I don't know, out of 150 kids, I didn't want to make a bad decision about where somebody should be at any given time. So, and your kids after a while, and you have a pretty good idea where they should be. But I always, almost always, let kids choose. I would describe the 3 different levels or the 2 different choices or whatever. And then I want you to choose what you want to do. And so how I set this up, though, is at the beginning of the year, like that first week of school, we would do some learning styles inventories. And I know learning styles are kind of controversial now in terms of accuracy. They were great, 15 years ago when I started doing this. But it doesn't hurt to do them, just in terms of what you want to set the tone is that everybody has strengths and weaknesses. And even if science isn't your best subject, I'm going to help you do the best you can. And you may be great at other things, and that's okay, but in science, you might need a little more help, and that's fine. Or you might need a little more help sometimes. You're having a bad day. You got a lot of other things going on, whatever. And it's okay to admit that you need a little bit of help sometimes. And other times you won't, and that's fine. And so, and then we color coded the leveled selection. So whenever there was an option of 2 or 3 things, we had color codes, and I would describe the different requirements at the different levels. Red's going to do this, green's going to do this, purple's going to do this. choose the one that best fits. And if kids chose terribly wrong, we might have a little side conversation. Like, your struggling special ed kid chose the purple, it's the highest one. Like, okay, you can try it, but if you get stuck, let me know. We'll just switch it out. And so that worked really well. And so I think it's helpful to just kind of have this, sense of classroom culture where it's okay to know yourself on that given day and choose, what you need for that day. So that's our quick spiel on differentiation. And I'm going to turn it over to Barb because she's going to talk about the standards-based grading tools that we have now for the pre-post tests.
Okay, that's great. All right. Do you want to keep sharing the slides, Chris?
I can, Barb, if you want. That's
okay,
fine.
Sure. That's great. All right, let's roll on to the next slide then. So as you're grading these three-dimensional or NGSS aligned assessments, we'd really like you to think about grading them holistically. It's a little different than how we've graded our traditional assessments where a student might get, say, 8 out of 10 correct, and that's an 80%, and that's a B minus. So instead of that, what we'd really like to have you do is take a look at that sense-making structure of the assessment bundle. So usually there's a part A, part B, part C, and students will work through, usually it starts out with some basic DCI questions, oftentimes multiple choice, get them thinking about what the topic is. Then lots of times we bring in the SEP, so there'll be a model, there might be some data, something like that, and we usually ask a few questions to get them focused in on what we want them to notice about that model or that data or whatever. And then usually at the end of the assessment bundle or cluster, in the final part, we'll bring in the CCC and we'll have them explain or solve the problem. And they usually have to bring in like the cause and effect or predict or how does this system and system model or those sorts of things. So that's the basic structure of how these are. So it's really difficult to grade them if you don't think about it holistically. So what we would ask you to do is like consider holistically, and then as they work through that sense-making process, be thinking about what level your students would be. So here's what we would say. Level 1 would be approaching basic. Maybe they need help even to get those really early DCI multiple choice questions correct. At level 2, the basic level, they can do that, but they're doing it on their own. They don't need adult or peer help to do that. They can get the very basic DCI knowledge usually. At level 3, this is proficient. This is where we want students to be. And usually that's the middle chunk of the cluster. So it's generally the DCI and oftentimes then the SEP and maybe even a little bit of that CCC, but not very sophisticated. And maybe in that final sense-making part, there have some misconceptions or it's not a very sophisticated. The majority of your class should really be at level 3. Level 3 is the goal. Generally, the final question we give is open-ended response, it's constructed, and it requires them to put everything together. So they've got to think about the DCI, they've got to add in what they learned from that SEP, and then they've got to look through the lens of the CCC to finally make sense of the phenomenon or to solve the problem. So at level 4, we really consider them at mastery, and they are integrating all 3 dimensions, making sense, and arguing, using a CER, developing, using those sorts of things. So those are your kids who really are at the top, very mastery level with some sophistication. All right. So we try to give you some guidance. In the past, we've done this for the EAs and we haven't for the pre-post test. We've recently added in our newly revised units, we're adding some grading guidance with our pre-post. And so you can see we've got that pre-post leveling and there are 4 questions. And in this case, we tell you the parts that we think students might get correct in order to show evidence of each level of proficiency. So, and they should show greater proficiency as they work through. The main thing I want to make sure that I emphasize is that these are just suggestions. As we were writing these assessments, this is what we thought, but you may find that you see something different in your classroom. Feel free to change these parts correct at each level to what works for you. These are just suggestions from our thinking. So feel free to change them if that works better for you. Okay, so here's the process we suggest when you're trying to score assessments. Think about students in levels. So your goal is to determine what level of proficiency, starting at 1, ending at 4, mastery, is this student based on their responses. So use that leveling information that we give you, or your own, if ours doesn't match what works for your classroom, and your professional judgment to determine which items or what type of response serves as evidence of each level of proficiency. I find it helpful to read a few student responses of different ability levels before I even start to determine that. So I'll take one of my higher performing students, more of my grade level, and my lower performing students, and I'll read them and see, oh, okay, this is kind of the range I'm dealing with, and here's what I'm going to expect at each level. Then as I grade, I'm going to look at each cluster holistically. What did they do well, and where did they fall apart? And then I'm going to determine where on that continuum a student might be. So I'm going to see which items did they get right, which items did they get wrong, which items did they do a really good job on, which items did they struggle a little bit on. Where am I going to place them? Are they at a level 2, 2.5, 2.8, 3, 3.4? What do I think? Then I'm going to take that level and I'm going to use a converter to assign a percent or point value to the level you've determined for the students. So oftentimes what we say, these are just 2 examples. You can find lots of these if you just put into your search standards-based to traditional grading, you'll get something like this. But notice that on both of these, a level 3 is really in the A range. And if that's your goal for students, you might really consider that. When I first started standards-based grading, it was like level 2 was a C, level 3 was a B, you had to be at level 4 to get an A. And that doesn't really make sense when we consider how rigorous it is for students to integrate all 3 dimensions. So we kind of think about, you can use whatever grading scheme you want, but these are a couple that seem to match well with the way we write our assessments. So something to think about. So given this information, and one caveat that I might say is we've had MyStar teachers who have said, you know what, this is baloney. I'm just gonna assign points to each part. So part A, we're so many points. Part B, we're so many points. And on and on. If you decide to do that, that's fine, but just make sure that you're very conscious of how you assign your points, because if you assign too many points to the earlier ones, your grades are going to be inflated. But if you say, well, hey, that part D, that very last part, that's really demanding, I'm going to make that worth 5 points. Keep in mind that might be the level 4, and a lot of your grades then are going to be really deflated, and you're going to have really discouraged kids because you're expecting mastery level. So really think about, if you're going to use points, how you're going to assign those. Okay, so let's think about that leveling. And this is just a little exercise. Obviously, it's very hard to determine this without reading student responses, but we thought this would be a way we could just kind of think about this. So given this information, think about each of these students and determine what level and what grade you would assign them for this cluster scenario based on the parts that they got correct. So you can assign levels between a 2, 3, and 4. For example, you could assign a 3.5 or 3.8 or a 2.6, whatever you think. So we've got Emma. And if you look at our leveling recommendations, if they get question or part A right, level 2, in order to get a level 3, they would need to get A, B, C, and D correct. And in order to get to level 4, they would have to get all of those plus do a good job on question E, or that last part of the cluster. So Emma was able to get A, B, C, and D correct, but E is incomplete. She really couldn't even answer it completely. Ahmed got B, C, D, and E correct and complete, but A, that multiple choice, that first DCI question, he missed. Asia got all of it complete and correct. So we're going to ask you to think about where you might place these students in terms of level of proficiency and what kind of a grade you might assign to them.
Okay, so I'm going to make 2 breakout rooms now, because if we have enough people, I think, to have a little conversation. And the whole purpose of this is just for you to kind of practice. So if you do want to use this, these guidance things, you know, just kind of practice and talk out, what am I gonna do with the kids that don't follow the exact pattern that MyStar has described. And so we have on slide 27, team 1, and on slide 28, team 2. So if you can just talk about the results for each of these kids, come up with a number. What would you make that on your scale? And you can use the scales on 25, whichever one you want, or whatever you want to use there, and then just a little reasoning. So we give you a few minutes. And again, the purpose is just to get you kind of used to practicing these recommendations. And I think you'll see that, hey, you know, this could work. They're working pretty well. So I'm going to go ahead and open the rooms and take a few minutes, chat a little bit, assign each kid a number, and then a percentage, and then a little bit of reasoning. Okay, everybody's back. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Really well done, everyone. I think we're probably kind of in agreement. Asia's easy, right? She's got everything right. For Emma, we agree, is proficient in the 90%, A, low A, proficient. Ahmed is the one that is a little bit tricky, right? Because he missed A, which is probably a DCI multiple choice, right? Pretty easy. We would want to see evidence of that in that final part E, that he understood that maybe he just misread the question, or maybe he just didn't quite understand what was being asked. But then if he showed us evidence that he understood it in the final sense-making constructed response, most teachers might feel comfortable just dinging him a little bit. And like, if you look at team 2, they gave him a 3.5. They dinged him a little bit because he got the one-dimensional DCI question wrong, but correctly answered the level 4. So that's a little bit of a higher score because we had to do some integration in order to get that. So Ahmed is the one you'd really want to take a look at, like, what did that final response look like, to know how much you would take off his response. And I thought it was really interesting that Emma, actually, Ahmed, for group 2, Ahmed got a higher grade than Emma because the putting it together higher rigor question was wrong, where Ahmed missed the easier, just more one-dimensional scaffolding kind of question. So really well done. I know this is hard to do without looking at real student responses, but at least it gives you a little bit of a sense of how you might do this in your classroom when you're grading these. All right, well done.
All right, thanks. Yeah, I when Barb started putting those together, I was like, oh, I think I could finally do this now. So we wanted you to have the opportunity to try it and see that it's pretty doable
without having to read through
yeah
responses.
Yeah, in our speed event here. So cracking the CER codes, and we'll spend about 10 or 15 minutes reviewing this, and then we'll do some questions if you have them. So we've done this at MSTA. You know, if you've been to MSTA, you may have seen this one before. It's we've been doing it for a couple years, and so we always start out with what do your students struggle with? Is it the claim part, the evidence part, the reasoning part, or all of it? And so there's some stars here down below. So if you would jump in on slide 30 and just move a star into the part that they struggle with, and if it's all of it, you can put your star over by the all of it. So go ahead and take a minute and vote with a star. When we do this in a session, we do 4 corners. So we have the 4 signs up around the room and people actually get up and move to the corner. The part of this that their kids struggle with the most. All right. And so this is kind of the pattern that we see over and over again. The bulk of teachers will say it's the reasoning part that they fall down on, and I don't know how to help them, which was exactly how I saw this in my classroom. In fact, I argued one time with somebody who was doing PL from another curriculum about CERs. I was like, I just don't think this is developmentally appropriate because I've been trying it for years and everybody I know has been trying it. We can't get kids to do the reasoning and I don't know what to tell them even to describe it. So the reasoning is, I think, probably the hardest part. Sometimes kids do struggle with the evidence. Sometimes they struggle with coming up with a reasonable claim. Sometimes people will say it's just all of it's hard, but it's that reasoning piece that we were struggling with at MyStar. So a couple of years ago, we were talking about it and I was asking the MyStar researchers, the people who are research scientists for a living, like, what is this all about? And they're like, well, I don't know. They all kind of had different explanations of how they would, or different definitions of how they would define an explanation. And they didn't really think about it in their daily science work. They just kind of wrote things, right? Because you're way up at this level. And so thinking about how to break that down for kids, they're kind of all over the place. And so Steph and I decided to kind of dig into this. And so we started with the NGSS appendix and to see how the framework defines an explanation. And here's what they say. An explanation includes a claim that relates how a variable or variables relate to another variable or a set of variables. I was like, all right, nobody knows. This is gobbledygook. This makes no sense to me or, to kids. So we dug a little farther, deeper and to figure out where did that, 3-piece graphic organizer come from. Somebody had to have made it up. And it turns out, I believe it was Joe Kraychek he was at U of M then, he's at Michigan State now, and Kate McNeil, and both of them were some of the original authors of the NGSS framework. And they actually published this book in 2012, so before NGSS, but kind of right before. And they, claim we've been using it for years and it works really well for kids. So we kind of dug into the book and found a few hints and clues and kind of what were they thinking when they did this. And so it turns out that Paul Anderson, who does Bozeman Science, has a really nice video explaining claim evidence reasoning. And he suggests doing this thing, he calls it frame the claim, where basically you call out what are the science principles involved. And then so that we're all on the same page with this claim, what are those laws and theories? And then you ask kids to roll that into the reasoning piece. And I was like, all right, let's check this with the framework. And sure enough, the framework says, and when it's, the descriptions of what the CER, the descriptions of the behaviors for the CER, one of those bullets says they should be able to construct an explanation based on evidence and the assumption that theories and laws that describe the natural world operate today as they did in the past and will continue to do so in the future. I was like, all right, they're admitting theories and laws, the science principles that we know, that should be part of this. So what we did was we decided that in our framework, we're going to add a part. And right now I'm going to tell you that because we came up with this a year or two ago and some of our stuff has been done well before that, not all of the CERs that you come across in MyStar have this scientific principle piece in them. And if they don't, you're more than welcome to add it. It's coming up for discussion in the next few weeks as we wrap up our revised units. Should this be one of our next projects? Kendall Hunt keeps kind of, they don't like it when we change things because then they have to change the workbooks. But this, we would like to be more consistent with this. But anyway, so even if you see a CER without this, you can always add this for your kids in the Google Doc. But if we add the scientific principle piece to the organizer, to the graphic organizer, and you can even give kids that scientific principle. You don't have to make them come up with it on their own unless you want to. And then we structure the reasoning piece so that they're going to restate that principle. Then they're going to summarize the evidence, and then they're going to tie them together. So that whole, tie together the evidence and the claim, in your reasoning, now it has a structure. Now it's like a 5-sentence paragraph or a hamburger paragraph. Like, this is a writing process. And in English class, we give kids structures when we're just beginning. This isn't super sophisticated scientific writing, but they're just beginners, right? So let's help them identify those principles and then give them some prompts so that they can tie the principle to the evidence and pull it together in that reasoning statement. So what are some ways you can scaffold this? Add a box for the principle to help them so that it's right there in their faces. Add sentence starters in the reasoning box. You can add prompts in any of those sections, sentence starters, reminders of what they're supposed to put there. You could fill in the claim. I would almost always give kids a claim. Why make them struggle over that? We're all talking about the same thing. You can fill in the scientific principles, so that doesn't slow them down. You could list one piece of evidence as an example. Some of our stuff in 6th grade even is multiple choice, right? So there's like 4 or 5 pieces of evidence, select the ones that are appropriate, those kinds of things. And so, go ahead. You don't have to give kids a blank piece of paper with, the graphic organizer and it's all empty, because that can be a little bit overwhelming sometimes for kids, and they kind of shut down. So fill in bits and pieces and give them those sentence starters and think about asking them to tie that scientific principle into the reasoning. And now your reasoning isn't just all the evidence repeated, right? There's kind of a better purpose to it. So again, that's my 3-minute review of that. And then we talked about argumentation, because that was another thing that I kept asking the research scientists. Okay, so this is a different SEP. Like, what's the difference between an explanation and an argument? It kind of seems like the same thing to me. And so looking at the framework, an argument goes beyond, it says, this one's easier to read. It goes beyond reaching agreements and explanations. An argument is used to listen to, compare, and evaluate competing ideas based on their merits. So an argument is when maybe there are 2 or 3 different explanations, and we want to figure out which one is right. And so there's going to be some persuasion involved. And so you're writing not just an expository piece like that CER, but you're writing something that's persuasive. And so, if you talk to your English teachers, that's, a whole style of writing kind of separate from other styles. And so CERs are expository writings, like kind of just the facts, ma'am. And then arguments are going to be facts, but you're going to kind of couch it or, set it up in a way that's persuasive because you're considering competing explanations. That's not going to happen in every situation. Especially in middle school. It happens maybe more in high school, but it can occasionally happen where you'll want kids to do argumentation. And so...
Can I ask a question with that real quick then?
Sure.
Do you mind going back to the previous slide?
This one?
Yeah, so I guess sometimes I was thinking that all of the CERs in MyStar, or a lot of them, are more arguments, or it's presented that way. And I felt like but for example, in the chat, we've been talking about 7.1's argument, which is very difficult for the students, because I think they see it, and even myself as a teacher, see it as it's supposed to be an argument, but it does actually, I was just telling this to my coworker, it feels expository. I always say that word wrong, expository. So it's probably supposed to, but like, how do we, I guess I'm just maybe just letting you know that it's like sometimes hard to tell if it's supposed to be more argument where you're like persuading someone, or if it's more like that first bullet point, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah.
I filed this because lesson 7, I feel like Jamie's trying to persuade us. Do you know what I'm talking about? Lesson 7 and 7.1, where Jamie has all the options for the solution, right? And he's trying to persuade us that one is it. And that's like, I felt like the scaffold into the students writing their CER to the solution in lesson 8, right? For what Jamie's going to use to harvest energy from the environment. And then they have to write a CER on how the harvesting machine stores energy and then transforms the energy, right, to electrical energy. And I want it to be expository because you want to go back and find evidence. But when I looked at the teacher guide, right, and like the answer came, like, I felt like these were two conflicting things. But I do like the new models that you guys are posting up. Those are a lot better.
I think it's just like sometimes it's hard, like we're saying you're arguing to your parents, but then when it's like an argument, it's more persuasive, but the students are supposed to write it as more of like a CR explanation.
I think what you're seeing is a development of kind of a understanding with the MyStar staff as we do this work and get feedback and dig into it. And so probably what you're seeing is 7.1 was written before we kind of agreed upon these definitions. And so we know, thanks for your feedback. And I'm jotting down some notes here. And you know, we have a small staff, and our focus has been doing those, getting all the units revised, but we're coming to the end of that, and we're trying to like decide where do we focus our time next, and cleaning up our CER and argumentation pieces so that they are consistent is on the list. Okay.
Well, this is helping out quite a bit because now it makes sense with like why it was written that way. So thank you. Sorry, continue.
And I told you, I asked the people who are the research scientists, so like, we don't really know. We kind of use them in like when they're writing, papers for publication, they don't say, this is my CER, this is my argument. They're just writing as professionals. And so it gets kind of blended together. And then when you try to explain it to kids, in NGSS, they've made it 2 different practices. And so we're like, well,
and it's like, you can't teach kids 2 different things at the same, like, they don't get that. It's either one or the other.
Yeah, no. And I believe you can't really write a good argument unless you have a CER kind of framework set up in your already, right? So it's just kind of argument is the next step. Like, you have to have evidence and reasoning in your argument. So
and I think too, that claim just makes it inherently feel like an argument. If I'm making a claim, I'm arguing for something to be true based on evidence, and I'm reasoning. So it is a little bit like murky, and I see where it would be really hard for kids, because sometimes our claims are even set up where it's this or that, and you make your claim, and inherent is that is a little bit of an argument, right?
Yeah. And I'm not sure the professional scientists can really tell you that they're not always separate issues. But in general, I like it helped me to kind of wrap my mind around it. Okay, so an argument is when you kind of take what you've come up with in your CER, but then you're working to make a claim to persuade people. And then when you get to the high school level, they add in this rebuttal and counterclaim piece, which really then you're like, okay, now I kind of get why this is an argument, because you're acknowledging what other people are saying, but then explaining why your answer is the correct one. And that's we don't ask kids to do that a lot in middle school, but in the high school, if you look in the framework, under construct an argument, high school kids are asked more often to consider writing rebuttals or addressing counterclaims in their actual argument. Anyway, if you're asking kids to write an argument, some sentence starters that you can use to help them, their argument's probably not going to be tremendously different from their explanation, but if you kind of couch it in persuasive language, these are some things that you can use as sentence starters. This is an example that I actually just modified slightly from the Kraychek and Kate McNeil book. And we have two of these in our off-the-shelf lesson. One is well-written, one is not. And so one of the things we ask kids to do in the connect of that lesson is to compare a well-written one to a not well-written one. And that's another way to help kids learn about CERs or arguments, is to not necessarily always construct their own, but let's look at two examples and compare them. And I wanted to add this. This is from a MyStar teacher who worked with us on that off-the-shelf lesson. And she did this in her classroom, and I thought it was kind of brilliant. Before she did any kind of argumentation, she had kids describe what does it feel like when they're in an argument. And they came up with all the stuff on the left. And then they went through the off-the-shelf lesson and did the argument exercises in that. And then she had them, kind of do a consensus discussion about, well, what's the difference between an academic argument and a regular argument, right? And so it's okay to have counterclaims, and it's okay to have rebuttals, and we're not going to, this is an academic discussion. It's not going to be, shouldn't feel threatening or upsetting. It's okay to disagree, and we can do that in a civil way. So this is the just the review of that off-the-shelf lesson, if that's something that you're interested in using with your kids. And that's it for and we've got about 20 minutes, 20 minutes left. So that's our quick fly through of 3 hours of presentations in about 60 minutes. So thanks for that. And I know you guys have been great about asking some questions, and it's nice that it's a small group here. We could do breakout rooms, but it's such a small group. If you would like, we can just, what do you guys have questions on? Anything that you heard that you want to know more about? I'm taking some notes on some of your feedback. What did you hear that you would like to know a little bit more about while we're here?